The wind howled something fierce as it whipped against the windows of my cabin in Wyoming. The kind of night that'd make even a seasoned bastard like me think twice about stepping outside. But it wasn't the cold that had me on edge. It was the damn letter sitting on my kitchen table, edges soaked from the snow I'd tramped in earlier. It was postmarked from Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, a place I knew only by reputation, thick with swamps and stories that'd make your skin crawl. The sheriff's scrawl was damn near illegible, but the message bled through clear enough. Folks were dying, and not in any way that made sense unless you were a hunter like me. Bodies found torn apart, limbs missing, and not just adults, kids too. We're out of our depth here, Lucas. Heard about your work. Could use someone of your expertise. Whatever's doing this, it ain't natural. Come soon. Hell, it was almost flattering if it wasn't so damn tragic. I stared at the letter, the words burning into me. Kids. That part always hit hard. Monsters are real, all right. Some are just missing their scales. I took a long drag from my cigarette, letting the smoke curl in the cold air, mingling with the scent of pine and impending snow. Decision made, I crushed the butt under my boot and started packing. My gear was always half ready. Life had taught me that much. Always be ready to move. By morning, I was in my truck, the landscape whizzing by as I made the long drive down to Louisiana. The closer I got, the more the temperature changed. Snow gave way to rain. Rain gave way to muggy heat, even in winter. Breaux Bridge welcomed me with open arms and suspicious eyes. Small town, small trust. I headed straight for the sheriff's office, a squat building flanked by moss-draped trees that seemed to watch me as closely as the townsfolk. Inside, the sheriff was a hulking man named Doucet, his accent thick as the humidity outside. "You the hunter from Wyoming?" he asked, sizing me up like I might be another kind of beast. "Heard you've seen your fair share of dark shit." "Enough to know there's always more lurking," I replied, keeping my tone even. "You got a file on these attacks?" Sheriff Doucet handed over a folder stuffed with reports, photos, and the kind of nightmares that keep you up at night. We pored over each case, his voice low and gravely, mine clipped and cold. Facts and figures traded over coffee that tasted like the bottom of a tar pit. As dusk settled, painting the swamp in shades of crimson and gold, I knew I was walking into a different kind of hell. A wet, writhing hell that slithered through the undergrowth and whispered in the shadows. That night, I set up at the edge of town, close to where the last body was found. The air was thick, heavy with the promise of rain and the stench of decay. I loaded my rifle, the familiar weight a comfort against the backdrop of an uneasy swamp that seemed to breathe and murmur with secrets it wasn't ready to give up. "Whatever you are," I muttered into the dark, "come out and face me like a fucking man, not some coward in the reeds." But the swamp just hissed back, a long, slow sound, like a warning. Tonight, the hunter was home, and I was damn sure ready to show this monster that it wasn't the only predator lurking in these parts. The sun hadn't even crested the horizon when I set out from my temporary base at the edge of town, my boots crunching on the frost that had settled overnight. Despite the chill, the air was heavy with humidity, a reminder that I was far from Wyoming's dry cold. Breaux Bridge was waking up slow, the mist hanging over it like a shroud. I made my way to the diner where I was supposed to meet a couple of the locals who had agreed to talk, reluctantly, urged on by Sheriff Doucet. The bell over the door jangled as I entered, drawing a round of solemn nods from the few early risers sipping their coffee. "Lucas Moore," I introduced myself, sliding into the booth across from a middle-aged couple who looked like they hadn't slept in days. Their eyes were hollow, their faces etched with the kind of grief that comes from seeing too much. "Marie and Joseph Landry," the woman said, her voice barely a whisper. "Our boy Thomas. He was one of the ones taken." Her husband picked up the tale, his voice a gravelly contrast to his wife's soft tones. "He was just outside, not even past the porch. It was like the creature came out of the swamp just for him. Listening to their story, the details painted a grim picture. The attacks weren't random. They were targeted, precise. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't some mindless beast. It was hunting. Armed with their testimony and a few more like it, I headed towards the swamp. The ground squelched under my boots, the air filled with the sounds of insects and the occasional splash of something unseen moving through the water. It was a different kind of wilderness here, one that was alive in a way that made my skin crawl. Hours passed as I trekked deeper, following the tracks that were too large to be anything normal. That's when I heard it. A rustle to my left. Something big moving through the brush. I turned just in time to see it. The Swamp Wraith, its scales glistening with a mix of mud and what I hoped wasn't blood. It was more horrifying up close, a grotesque blend of man and beast, its eyes burning with a malevolent intelligence. It roared, a sound that vibrated through the marsh and charged. The ground was slippery, mud nearly pulling my boots off, but I managed to raise my rifle and fire. The shot went wide, the creature's movement a blur of speed and power that didn't match its size. I stumbled back, trying to put some distance between us, my heart pounding as it advanced. Then, as quickly as it had attacked, it retreated, disappearing into the thick reeds with an agility that left me cursing in frustration and disbelief. Breathing hard, I checked my gear, reassured to find everything intact. The encounter had been brief, but telling. The creature was as fast and fierce as the stories claimed, and now it knew I was here. As the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the murky water, I made my way back to the edge of the swamp. I needed a new plan. Brute strength wouldn't work. This thing was too damn quick, too cunning. It was time for a different approach. A trap. That night, under the faint glow of a lantern, I sketched out a strategy in my notebook. The locals had mentioned the creature often lurked near an old grove deep in the swamp, drawn by something unseen. If I could lure it there, maybe I could level the playing field. Exhaustion pulled at my bones, but my mind raced with possibilities. Tomorrow, I would set the trap. And one way or another, I'd face the Swamp Wraith again. This time, I'd be ready. The darkness closed in, filled with the sounds of the swamp. A reminder that in places like this, you're never truly alone. The morning fog draped over Bro Bridge like a wet blanket, muffling sounds and blurring the outlines of the swampy landscape as I gathered my gear. The trap I had in mind required precision and patience, qualities that the swamp seemed determined to test with its incessant drips and chilling mists. I returned to the spot where I had encountered the Swamp Wraith the previous day. The ground was still torn up, the vegetation flattened in a clear path that marked the creature's retreat. I set up near the old grove, a place the locals had whispered about, full of superstitions and warnings. According to them, the grove was where the creature hunted most frequently, drawn by an ancient, sunken relic half buried in mud. The trap was simple but brutal, a series of steel bear traps linked by heavy chains, camouflaged with layers of wet leaves and moss. If the Wraith was as bound to this place as the townsfolk believed, it would come. Setting everything up took the better part of the day. The physical labor a welcome distraction from the eerie sounds that echoed softly from deeper within the swamp. As night approached, I retreated to a nearby blind, my rifle loaded with custom rounds designed to penetrate the creature's thick, scaly hide. Hours ticked by, each minute stretching out as the swamp came alive with the croaks of frogs and the distant calls of night birds. Then, silence fell. A pressing, heavy silence that felt like a weight on my chest. It was here. The first snap of a trap closing broke the silence with a metallic clang that echoed like a gunshot. I peeked through my blind to see the Wraith thrashing violently, one leg caught. It roared in pain and fury, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the trees. I took aim and fired. The shot hit, but the creature was far from down. It snapped the chain of the first trap with a terrifying display of strength, limping towards the next trap. Snap! Another leg caught, another roar, but still it fought, dragging the heavy chains as it moved. Adrenaline surged through me as I emerged from the blind, firing round after round. The creature was slower now, weakened by its injuries in the traps, but it was not yet defeated. It turned towards me, eyes blazing with a malevolent intelligence and hatred. We circled each other in the grove, the wraith snarling, me breathing hard, both of us bloodied and battered. It lunged suddenly, faster than seemed possible in its condition, forcing me to roll away, feeling the whoosh of its claws near my face. I scrambled to my feet, knowing this was my moment. The creature was close to the third trap, the last and largest. With a yell, I feinted to the left, then darted right, drawing it in. The creature, driven by rage and pain, followed blindly. The snap of the final trap echoed like a victory cry as it clamped around the creature's neck. Still, it fought, but its movements grew sluggish. I approached cautiously, rifle aimed at its heart, and with a final, respectful nod to the beast that had tested every ounce of my skill, I fired. The Swamp Wraith shuddered once, then lay still, the life fading from its eyes. I stood there, panting, the swamp silent once more, as if it too respected the end of this brutal dance. Exhausted and drenched in sweat and mud, I dismantled my traps and prepared to head back to town. The battle had been won, but the cost lingered in my aching bones and the scars that would no doubt add to my collection. As I left the grove, the ancient relic, now fully exposed by the struggle, caught my eye. An old, carved stone with inscriptions too worn to read. Whatever secrets it held about the Wraith, they would remain here, in the depths of the swamp, silent witnesses to the night's ferocity. The dawn was just breaking, casting a pale light that seemed to cleanse the night's horrors as I trudged back to Bro Bridge. My body was bruised, my clothes were a tapestry of mud and blood, but in my heart, there was a grim satisfaction. The Swamp Wraith was dead. Its reign of terror was over. When I reached the sheriff's office, Sheriff Doucet was already waiting, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand that he offered to me with a nod. His face, usually so stern, softened slightly when he saw the state I was in. "You got it then?" he asked, his voice a mix of hope and weariness. I nodded, setting down the heavy bag that contained the creature's head, a grotesque trophy and proof of the deed. "It won't be troubling your town any longer," I replied, my voice hoarse from yelling and the swamp's damp chill. The sheriff looked relieved, but there was a question in his eyes, the same one I had seen in the faces of the townsfolk as I passed them on my way here. "What was it, Lucas? What did you find out there?" I told him about the ancient relic in the grove, the carvings that suggested a curse, perhaps one as old as the swamp itself. "It's over now," I concluded. "But there might be more to the story. That relic, it's important, might be worth looking into to prevent anything like this from happening again." Sheriff Doucet agreed, promising to send some folks from the university to examine the site. "And you, Lucas? What will you do now?" he asked as we stood outside, watching the sun rise fully above the horizon, casting long shadows that fled from the growing light. I thought about the question. The road called to me, as it always did after a hunt. There were other monsters out there, other shadows where things needed setting right. But this time, I felt a pull to stay, to see this through, to ensure that the curse was truly broken. "I'll stick around for a bit," I said finally. "Help with the cleanup, make sure everything is settled. After that," I trailed off, looking towards the horizon where the sky met the swamp in a line of misty gray. "After that, we'll see where the road takes me." As the day warmed and the townsfolk began to emerge, whispers of the night's event spread. There was a collective relief, a shared mourning for those lost, and a cautious hope for the future. I joined the sheriff and some of the locals in a small ceremony at the edge of town, a tribute to those who had fallen to the Swamp Wraith. We said a few words, and I felt the weight of every hunt I'd ever done, every monster I'd faced. Later, as I prepared to leave the sheriff's office, a young girl approached me. She couldn't have been more than 10, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and admiration. "Mr. Moore," she said timidly, "thank you for saving us." Her words struck a chord in me, a reminder of why I did what I did. It wasn't just the thrill of the hunt. It was the people. The lives changed. The communities saved. I knelt down, so I was at eye level with her, and smiled. "You're welcome," I told her. "Remember, always keep an eye on the shadows, but don't let them scare you. There's always light after the dark." She nodded, her smile brightening, and as she ran back to her family, I felt a lightness in my step. The road would always be there, calling to me with its silent song of dark and dangerous things. Walking away from the sheriff's office, I looked back once at the town that had survived the night, at the swamp that held its secrets close. Then, I turned my face to the sun, ready for whatever came next. The shadows of the past finally laid to rest.